we have completed our Pickwick Club discussions of the Old Curiosity Shop last month. And we have two more meetings of the Pickwick Club. Today's meeting, and in June, we will also be meeting again to discuss Silas Marner, George Eliot, Silas Marner. And those of you who've been with us for a long time, through the Old Curiosity Shop in particular, will remember that our president, Wayne Batten, suggested that together with the Old Curiosity Shop, we read another 19th century text that involves an elderly man and a young woman, a girl. And so Wayne suggested that we do Silas Marner along with Curiosity Shop. And today we're privileged to have Nancy Henry to help lead today's discussion. And Nancy is a professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and she is a scholar of Victorian literature, a colleague at the Dickens Project and the Dickens universe, a friend, and also a specialist in the works of George Eliot. She's written several books on George Eliot. The most recent is a biography of George Eliot entitled The Life of George Eliot, a Critical Biography. She's also written a book on George Eliot and the British Empire and the Cambridge Introduction to George Eliot, as well as other works. And she is new to the Pickwick Club, but not new to teaching Victorian literature and talking about it with friends. So I'm going to turn things over to Nancy and let her lead the discussion. So thank you, Nancy. We're pleased to have you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, John. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Ava, for all of your technical help. Ava's going to be running the PowerPoint for me and also helping me to look for raised hands and checking on the chat when that's relevant. But it's great to see so many people here, some familiar faces. I'm really excited about talking about Silas Marner, and specifically the first 10 chapters of Silas Marner. I'm going to assume we're not going to get into spoilers of the rest of the novel yet. So there's plenty to talk about because there's so much that goes on in the first half of this novel. I was gonna just start with a few brief comments about reception, and I wanted to share a personal anecdote, and then we're gonna get into discussion. I have passages that I'd like to discuss, but of course I'm just open to hear whatever questions and comments that you might have. So Ava, if we just want to get ready with the first, yeah, just leave it there for a sec. So some of you may know that Silas Marner was a standard in the high school curriculum in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. You might know this from personal experience, or you might know it from your parents' personal experience. One of our Victorianist colleagues, Andrew Elfenbein, has written a very interesting article called "The United States of Ravelot," about how and why Silas Marner came to be the thing that all high school students in the United States were required to read, and also how that created something that he called Marner phobia, a dread and hatred of Silas Marner by all the little children who were made to read it at much too young an age, and perhaps in an uninspired way. And the story that I just wanted to share with you briefly was that I grew up with a mother who'd been made to read Silas Marner in the 1940s when she was in 9th grade. And all my life I heard, read this, read that, but whatever you do, don't read Silas Marner. It's the most boring book in the world. And so Silas Marner had this kind of aura to me of something taboo that maybe I shouldn't read. So naturally, I ended up devoting my life to the study of the author of Silas Marner. But when my mom passed away, I found her copy of Silas Marner. And Ava, if we could have the first slide. This is the inside cover of that copy. You can see, Louisville Collegiate School. And I guess my point here is just that she obviously wasn't listening to her teacher when she was being taught Silas Marner. So that might possibly go a way toward explaining why she had Marner phobia, like so many other people in the early part of the 20th century. So Ava, could we have the next slide? Okay, so this is an image of the first edition of Silas Marner, published in 1861 in one volume. It is George Eliot's shortest novel. It wasn't serialized, it just came out in the one volume, and it followed from the publication of Scenes of Clerical Life, Adam Bede, and The Mill on the Floss. And just very quickly to position this novel for you in George Eliot's career, it came upon her as an inspiration, this idea, while she was writing a novel called Romola, which some of you may have read. It's set in 15th century Florence, and it's a kind of massive historical work of fiction, and it was quite oppressive to her, the writing of it. And she just said that this idea for writing Silas Marner came upon her while she was in the archive researching Renaissance Florence. And some of the themes in Silas Marner are similar to those of Romola, but the take on them is much more optimistic, I guess I would say, about humanity. You can already see that Silas Marner starts with themes of deception, secrets, blackmail, all kinds of dark themes. And we will talk about the end when we get to the end, but those themes in Romola are treated in an even darker and unredeemed kind of way. So I always think it's interesting to know that Silas Marner, which is sometimes described as a fable or fable-like, just kind of came to her as almost as a relief from this larger, more arduous project. Next slide, Ava. In case you don't know what George Eliot looks like, this is the only known photograph of her, and it was taken just a few years before she wrote Silas Marner. Marian Evans, of course, was her real name, George Eliot being a pen name. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about Marian Evans and her life. Now, maybe because Silas Marner was so read among high school people in the US, it has had an interesting afterlife. Next slide, Ava. Here's a comic book version of it. Next slide. Here is the Ben Kingsley adaptation, a BBC adaptation, I think it's from 1985, that, sorry, 1985, right, not 1895, 1985. And some of you might want to watch that. I definitely recommend it. And next slide. And this is something you might not have heard of. It is an adaptation of Silas Marner in a completely contemporary context. And it's starring Steve Martin. It's called A Simple Twist of Fate. And it's actually surprisingly good. And if you didn't already know the story of Silas Marner, you might not even know that it was an adaptation of Silas Marner. But it's something that I've enjoyed and I've taught even as well. So next slide. I'd like to begin by just talking about the beginning of the novel, the first page. And I guess maybe, Ava, should we come out, if you can find the passage in your copy, if you can just find the first page, and then should we come out of screen share so that we can see hands. Let me get my gallery view back up there. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read the first paragraph, or at least much of it. But when we look at future passages, I'd also be happy to have other people read as well. So let's just see how it goes. I think that the first paragraph introduces a lot of really interesting, relevant themes and ideas. So here we go. In the days when the spinning wheels hummed busily in the farmhouses, and even great ladies clothed in silk and thread lace had their toy spinning wheels of polished oak, there might be seen in districts far away among the lanes or deep in the bosom of the hills, certain pallid, undersized men who, by the side of the brawny country folk, looked like the remnants of a disinherited race. The shepherd's dog barked fiercely when one of these alien-looking men appeared on the upland, dark against the early winter sunset. For what dog likes a figure bent under a heavy bag? And these pale men rarely stirred abroad without that mysterious burden. The shepherd himself, though he had a good reason to believe that the bag held nothing but flaxen thread, or else the long rolls of strong linen spun from that thread, was not quite sure that this trade of weaving, indispensable though it was, could be carried on entirely without the help of the evil one. In that far-off time, superstition clung easily about every person or thing that was at all unwonted, or even intermittent and occasional merely, like the visits of the peddlers or the knife grinder. No one knew where wandering men had their homes or their origin, and how was a man to be explained unless you knew somebody who knew his father and mother? To the peasants of old times, the world outside their own direct experience was a region of vagueness and mystery. To their untraveled thought, a state of wandering was a conception as dim as the winter life of the swallows that came back with the spring. And even a settler, if he came from distant parts, hardly ever ceased to be viewed with a remnant of distrust, which would have prevented any surprise if a long course of inoffensive conduct on his part had ended in the commission of a crime, especially if he had any reputation for knowledge or showed any skill in handicraft. All cleverness, whether in the rapid use of that difficult instrument, the tongue, or in some other art unfamiliar to the villagers, was in itself suspicious. Honest folk born and bred in a visible manner were mostly not overwise or clever, at least not beyond such a matter as knowing the signs of the weather, and the process by which rapidity and dexterity of any kind were acquired was so wholly hidden that they partook of the nature of conjuring. In this way, it came to pass that those scattered linen weavers, immigrants from the town into the country, were to the last regarded as aliens by their rustic neighbors, and usually contracted the eccentric habits which belong to a state of loneliness. So obviously, a lot of this language is very interesting to us. Immigrants, aliens, disinherited race, general sense of otherness among people who have spent their entire life in one place. And I'm just happy to start taking thoughts and comments about this, but it's important for you to know that George Eliot was very interested in a couple of things. One is displacement of this sort. She herself had left her Midlands rural home and come to London and would never go back again because for complicated reasons, she wasn't welcome back. She didn't feel welcome back by the town. So she's very interested in this kind of collective groupthink of small towns where people are condemned and ostracized for behavior that is not conventional. And we see this in Silas Marner, and we see it in Middlemarch, which of course is called not Dorothea Brooke, but it's called Middlemarch because the town itself, like the town of Raveloe in this novel, is a kind of character that has a voice, the voice of conventionality, the voice of fear and suspicion of anything that is strange. So George Eliot is obviously very critical of that provincial, uneducated, and irrational mindset. So that's part of both her own experience and the themes that she was dealing with. So rationality versus superstition is something that's going to come up again and again, as well as some other themes that I think are bred here. The tendency to other anyone who is unfamiliar or alien or from a different place. So yeah, I just wondered if anyone wanted to start us off with thoughts about the passage or.
So we have one hand up, Kathy.
Thanks, John.
Yes.
Hi,
We
Kathy.
can't
Just unmute.
unmute.
I was one of those teachers who taught it. And actually, I think I did a really, really good job because I had an artist boyfriend who would make all sorts of art for me because anyway, I won't go into it. I think I was successful and I really liked the book. So, other and alien, Silas is the other. He is definitely the other because he's been shunned, as was Elliot from her family. And what's happened to him is he's I don't want to go too far into it because I know we're only doing the first 10 chapters, but um, he he becomes isolated, lonely, and depressed, which, if any of you think about that, that's what everybody did in COVID. I mean, we don't it was a great experience, a terrible experience, but a great experience for us because we knew how, especially, and he was young when he did this, but old people, and he becomes the old person, that's what they feel like all the time. But Silas has felt like that from the very, very beginning. And he is, during Lantern Yard, I won't go into it all, but they shun him because of false information. And then
Mhm.
he, becomes the other forever, really. So the words in the very beginning, um, and the whole theme of the book, remedial influences of pure natural relations make a difference. And you can see the theme through the book in that in the second part, that's what changes him and makes him not the other.
Yeah, those are great and really essential points. I mean, I think it's also like worth remembering that when he is betrayed and kind of cast out as he is, he also loses his religion, which
Yeah,
had been so important to him. So part of what his story is told in the novel is about frankly finding a kind of replacement for that. And through these first 15 years, which we get in a pretty kind of rapidly narrated fashion, he doesn't have anything. He doesn't have anything except his work and his gold.
right.
So the things that he's lost, human community and religion, are the things that he's kind of searching. Well, he's not searching to replace. He's withdrawn.
Yeah,
But for George Eliot and for the larger Victorian culture, I think it's fair to say that the loss of religion, or the loss of religion among some people, including George Eliot, because she too was very religious as a young person and then lost her religion. The idea of, well, what can take the place of that in human community was a very serious and urgent issue that I think is getting raised here. So yeah, thanks for that.
And Kathleen.
Thank you. I just think this first bit is a wonderful foreshadowing of when Silas goes to the pub and says, I've been robbed. And after he realizes it's not Jem, the poacher, everyone thinks, oh, it has to be the tinker. It has to be this foreigner, this outsider that comes in. And it, what I mean, and they make up everyone has seen this, and then immediately they add on suspicions of, well, he looked shifty and he looked this, completely fabrication. I mean, because we know it wasn't the traveller who did it, but it does tie in with this fear of the outside, of not knowing who your parents and your grandparents were, and not having you sort of buried and connected into that small society.
Yeah, those are such excellent points. I mean, they immediately want to find someone to scapegoat, and of course, the person to scapegoat is the person who seems to be, not located in place, who has a foreign aspect. And then there is that whole element of gossip in a small town that George Eliot is very just wonderful at representing, and how a rumor can just go like a game of telephone, from being a vague rumor to being something that people are committed to absolutely believing. So I think false information, false news, things like that, we can also find that satirized and criticized in the novel, as well as this sort of xenophobic tendency to scapegoat the outsider. And I sometimes think, well, it's really lucky that peddler didn't come back around, because what might the community have actually done to him unjustly if he had come back around again. And I'll just add one more thing to that. I think there is a very interesting absence of institutional authority in this novel. There's not really a police. Well, there is a doctor, but there's also a wise woman healer. There's not, because there aren't any police, someone has to be deputized as a constable, and then when they can't find like who took his money, they're kind of like, oh well, I guess it just can't be known. And I think that's really important for the sense of isolation in this story. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But other institutions, like for example marriage, are also questioned and interrogated. Godfrey is like, nominally he's married to Molly, and he feels committed to that marriage, but what kind of a marriage is it really? And George Eliot, as you may know, was living with a man who was married to someone else and couldn't get divorced, and she and he therefore just like asserted their right to live together and be together, and they called themselves married, which today, we wouldn't really think anything of, but at the time it was really quite radical, because technically speaking, it was an adulterous relationship. But she felt that, why should he be bound by the fetters of marriage when he doesn't love this woman, he doesn't live with this woman, he lives with me. So the whole thing of the secret marriage is I think also related to this just exploration of basic institutions in the culture.
Glenna.
I want to talk about that first sentence. In the dark days when a spinning wheel was found in every farmhouse. Nancy, I'm a historian, so I always have to bring in details. Years ago, I heard a wonderful women's history lecture, and the woman, her research consisted in looking at images of women, even in medieval periods. And she said, no matter what the class, women were almost always depicted with a spindle in their hands. That cloth making was so arduous that women were constantly involved in it. And so I think it's interesting to bring that up. It's the first sentence of the novel. Silas Marner is a weaver. It locates the novel in pre-industrial times, and is just a very vivid way of conjuring a place and time and evoking that subtext of how important cloth making was and how time consuming it was before the Industrial Revolution.
Those are all excellent points. I mean, I think it's, clearly this novel is set back in time from its composition in 1861. The dates are not exactly clear, and it goes backwards and forwards, but we know that the Napoleonic Wars are still going on after Silas has been there for 15 years. So we're thinking that he probably emigrated around, say, 1800 to Ravelot, and then was there for 15 years, and then in the second part of the book we get another 15 years going forward. But George Eliot knew that it wouldn't be very long before weavers like this would not exist anymore, before they would be displaced by industrial textile production. And the other interesting, so there is that kind of like nostalgic historical aspect to the narrative from her perspective. But the other point that you brought up about women, and which is also here in the sentence, I mean, we can also think a little bit about Silas Marner's gender, about clearly, these pallid, undersized men are not models of conventional masculinity by any means. And Silas, as somebody who, is isolated and lives alone and has this particular artisan identity and vocation, is, I think, in a lot of ways, he's just feminized. And even more so as we move forward. So that, Glenn, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that, or if that's even what you had in mind, but a lot of it is there in the first sentence, as you say.
Great.
David.
Okay. I am David Brownell. I can't figure out how to change the identifier. I'm not masquerading as Tim Clark. I have some disconnected things to say. First, the impulse to regard outsiders as suspicious is one which has not gone away. In fact, it's something that President Trump is leader of. Second thought suggests the reason that the book was not popular with high school readers is that Eliot is really a sort of middle-aged novelist. You appreciate her more if you have some experience of life. What's going on in this book, both in the setting and in Silas, is something which a modern high school kid just doesn't recognize. So whoever's next.
Well, it does kind of raise the question of why some people thought that it was the thing, apart from the fact that it's just shorter than all of our other novels. And there is that. I mean, I think it was thought to have a wholesome moral, that's part of it. And then of course also, well, there's just the beauty of the writing. But yeah, I agree with you on both counts about the fear of foreigners today and the difficulty that modern high school students might have identifying with it.
Sarah.
Glenna loved it in 10th grade, so there's the exception to the rule.
Sarah.
So I just want to add that in addition to the community not willing to accept strangers, he wasn't like a typical stranger. He was very particular. Like he has his own character and he doesn't try to lose his identity and mingle with them. So when he cures the lady and suddenly he does something that they can appreciate and feel it's something they are doing, and they offer him like the friendship, in that regard, he doesn't take it because it's not something he believes in, curing people. It was so, and the same thing with his friendship with William Denn. She describes a lot, like everybody around knew that William Denn wasn't an honest person and not a good friend, but Silas couldn't recognize it. So he is also not good by himself in mingling in and creating friends, and he's not very interested.
Oh, that's a good point about his not being able to see through William Dane. He's a very kind of trusting soul, and kind of naive, I guess, in that sense.
Because everybody around, she describes how everybody around could see through William, but he trusted him even after he told him when he had these spells, these conscious spells, and he said the Satan is in you. And he accepted it, but then he didn't accept it after the crimes. Then he got it. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I'm an immigrant too, and I think in every world where you come, and I'm an immigrant, and my sabbatical was in Milwaukee, where they never saw a stranger in their life. This was in 1980s, and I think it's a two-way. It's your willingness, because they're strangers to me, I'm stranger to them. So it's a two-way thing. But for Silas, he didn't do his part, or he wasn't even interested to do his part.
Yeah, that's very true and very interesting. I mean, I think that the fact that he is so blind, is both a reality of his identity, but it's also somewhat metaphoric. And George Eliot does this with Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch. Like she doesn't understand the people around her. She doesn't see things. Her sister Celia is a lot more clear-sighted, and that she's literally nearsighted. So that becomes a kind of, so there's that, and then there is his unwillingness to open himself up to the community. Now, Sarah, you made this point about yourself being an immigrant, and George Eliot was very interested in the relationship between place and identity. And when she had to leave her home in the Midlands and move to London, and then, as I said before, she never went back, she nonetheless, kind of held on to the memories. The memories became really important, and they fed her writing, and her literature, and her imagined worlds were very much drawn from her childhood memories of specific places. And she does comment on this notion of exile in the novel. So there's a passage that I hoped we could look at. It's actually the first line, the first page of chapter 2. Even people whose lives have been made various. Now, it's a very long paragraph, so we don't have to read the whole paragraph. But would anyone like to read? I mean, I'm happy to read, but Martha. So first, if you could just read maybe about the first half of the first paragraph of
All right.
chapter 2.
Even people whose lives have been made various by learning sometimes find it hard to keep a fast hold on their habitual views of life, on their faith in the invisible, nay, on the sense that their past joys and sorrows are a real experience, when they are suddenly transported to a new land, where the beings around them know nothing of their history and share none of their ideas, where their Mother Earth shows another lap, a human life, has other forms than those on which their souls have been nourished, minds that have been unhinged from their old faith and love, have perhaps sought this Lethean influence of exile, in which the past becomes dreamy because its symbols have all vanished, and the present too is dreamy because it is linked with no memories. But even their experience may hardly enable them thoroughly to imagine what was the effect on a simple weaver like Silas Marner, when he left his own country and people and came to settle in Ravlo, is that in Ravlo? Do you want me to?
Actually, it's not that long. Maybe if
Did-
you could just read a little bit
you?
further, I think it's relevant. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could you
I said,
repeat that? I didn't hear you.
could you just read a little
Continue.
further?
Okay.
Mhm.
Nothing could be more unlike his native town, set within sight of the widespread hillsides than this low wooded region where he felt hidden even from the heavens by the screening trees and hedgerows. There was nothing here when he rose in the deep morning quiet and looked out on the dewy brambles and rank tufted grass that seemed to have any relation with that life centering in Lantern Yard, which had once been to him the altar place of high dispensations.
Okay, that's great. Let's stop there. And I guess I just wanted to introduce this idea of exile, and we've already talked about it a little bit, but the alienation that one feels when removed from from a familiar place where your experiences are located and where you have your roots. So the metaphor of uprooting, I think is very apt here. Silas is like a transplanted plant, where it's very difficult to get a hold on a new territory because the environment is so very different. Yeah, I just think it's an important thing to remember about his experience, his condition, and his identity.
Mm-hmm. Could I just add something? I'm a 1963 reader of Silas Marner.
Wow.
I was in 10th grade and I was not a happy camper, I have to say. I just couldn't get through it. It was really hard for me, but I am really enjoying it now. So at least I finally changed my mind.
I'm
Yeah.
right with you. I read it in 1963. I was in 8th grade. I did not like it. I loathed it. But I saw that you were doing it and said, before I pass this earth, I've got to find out if George Eliot wrote a good book or a really terrible book.
Well, I want to respond to David, who's talked about the effect of Silas Marner on high school kids, and I had to read the book about 4 years or 5 years before Martha, and I hated it. I just absolutely hated it. I thought it was as boring as it could be. Now I see it from a different point of view. So I agree that it's probably not a good choice for high school students. And
I will say this, that in the mentioning about money and taking care of money practically, I think might have been a good thing for teenagers to learn about. Make sure you use your money well and save and things like that. But I think overall it wasn't particularly.
To go back to what Glenna said earlier, talking about the vocabulary associated with weaving and spinning, as far as I know, the word spinster, which nowadays we think of an unmarried woman, an old maid, etc., I think came from women who spun cloth.
Mm.
So that's all.
Mm.
We
Yeah,
have some other hands up, Nancy. So I'm going to call on people who've been waiting. Barbara, and then Kathy Kresick and Clark.
Okay.
Well, being a person that grew up in a small town, and every single thing about what she says about small towns, I agree with. But I want to go back kind of to what Sarah was talking about. At the end of chapter 1, she goes even a step farther than she did here at the beginning, in that she indicates that a person that grows up in a very tight community like this would never even consider an act of reflection. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot, especially about my small town that I grew up in, and then about the characters in this book. when we get to the Casses, I mean, is there reflection there? I mean, that is a very damning comment, I think, that she made there at the end of the first chapter. We understand that, to me, her using this character, Silas Marner, to present the sophisticated things that she is presenting, it was a challenge to start with. And then, saying over and over again, he wouldn't have thought to try to analyze what William Dane had done. He wouldn't have even considered trying to figure it out. That's, as I say, a challenge for a writer to bring all that across. And I think she does, but yeah.
I mean, just to add quickly, I mean, that beginning about in the days of the spinning wheels, it does have that kind of fabulistic, like legendary quality to it. And all of that she's associating with superstition, lack of education, lack of sophistication. And like, as you said, trying to capture that for someone as sophisticated and educated as she was, was really quite a trick. So she's both representing it in a sympathetic way, and also her narrator is standing outside and analyzing it and criticizing it all at the same time, which is a real hallmark of George Eliot's narration. Some people love and some people hate.
Kathy and then Clark. Unmute. Kathy, we can't hear you. Can you unmute?
Yeah.
Kathy?
I'm trying.
Yes, okay.
Where do you do it?
We can hear you now.
You're muted again. Yeah.
Okay. So really quick, the one thing that's left out is he is the epitome of the other because he has epilepsy. That's not really, I don't think it appears that much in the book, as much as it, probably should, but she wrote it, I didn't. But the other thing is, I mean, this is just a take on Trump, who I hate, that who is going to be affected by Medicaid going away? It is the others. It is older people, and it is the disabled, and he's disabled. So I just need to throw that in because I hate Trump. That's it.
I'll just thanks for bringing that up. Obviously, Silas does have a disability. I don't know if there are any doctors here, but it's usually called catalepsy, which is a little different from epilepsy. But either way, he goes into fits and he doesn't know what's going on. And it is really important because people, like the narrator, I think, interprets this as a disability, as a disease that falls within the realm of medical knowledge, but so many people, as we see, interpret it as being like possessed by the devil, and that very active interpretation and the contest between like rational science and superstitious belief is really central to the novel. So Medicaid aside, thanks for bringing that up.
Clark.
Maybe the 60s killed Silas, because I never had to read Silas in high school, in the 70s, or college or grad school. But I'm teaching it right now. Thanks to Wayne's decision, I thought, why not teach this book? So I'm doing it rather naively, but I have to say, the diction and syntax are challenging. I'm teaching a class of 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. And the language is challenging at times, but it's a funny book. There's a lot of humor in this story, as well as seriousness. And the kids have really responded to the kind of fairy tale quality, and they've enjoyed thinking about how Eliot has blended the fairy tale with the realism. They, I think they know a lot about communities and dislocation and isolation. They certainly get they don't get all the jokes at the Rainbow, but they do get the humor of the Cass family. And we've just finished part 1, and they're also delighted by the twists and turns in the plot that are pretty delightful. So I am not saying I'm resurrecting the book forever, but this group has responded well. So I'm encouraged.
Good to know.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, and thanks for bringing up the humor. I mean, I think George Eliot is hysterical, but that's often forgotten in the moral seriousness of it. Like, I'm sure your students would appreciate the description of the Cass family home with the coats thrown on the chairs and the empty tankers, the half-empty tankers of beer lying around, and the horse whips like strewn all over the floor, and it's just like a bachelor pad, that she has a lot of fun describing, just as an example.
And you got an impaled horse. How often does that happen?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, I think. Yeah, I hope you can say to them, and also, not to give it away, but if you watch A Simple Twist of Fate, the obvious thing to do is to turn the horse into a car. But it's kind of like, Godfrey's expensive horse is kind of like a sports car, so it might help students to understand, oh, it's like giving your brother your sports car to drive, and he just like drives it into a tree or something. Although naturally, Eliot's got more sympathy for the horse than it's just, if it were just a car. But I think that could be very relatable in that sense to students.
Glenna, again.
I'm thrilled, Clark, that you are introducing students to it now. I just wanted to look back briefly on my own experience. I think I was somewhat of a pariah because I liked this book when I was in 10th grade. But my parents, and again, people in the fellowship have heard me talking about this, we read Pickwick Papers out loud when I was 11. I was introduced to Victorian literature. And so I loved it. I thought it was fun. I did not see it as arduous. And so with that background, I came to Silas Marner in a completely different frame of mind than most high school kids would have. And that's all I have to say.
Dorothy in the chat also noted that she read it in 1951 in the 9th grade and loved it. So there are a few of you out there, and I just love hearing about people who were asked to read Silas Marner in high school back in the day as well as in the present. It's very very interesting to me to hear these stories. So let's see. Is there anyone else in the queue, John?
Nope.
Okay, well then, in that case, maybe would you like to look at one of the, I guess, more famous passages? We need to talk about Silas as miser, and his nightly revelries with his gold coins. I'm curious how the students reacted to that, but also how you react to it. It's there is just something, the way George Eliot handles it, the way she represents, you get the image of him sort of like closing his curtains, and making his preparations and then taking out. It's all very a secret revelry is what it is. And for this poor lonely man to take this kind of joy, and on the one hand, I think you sort of feel like happy that he's taking pleasure in something, but then also just extremely uncomfortable, I guess, that he's just literally loving and tactily feeling his money in this way, or I don't know how he responded to it, but it's at the end of chapter 2, and I think it's worth. I think it's worth reading the passage. It's the last paragraph of chapter 2. this is the history of Silas Marner until the 15th year after he came to Raveloe. So that's the context of, he's been there for 15 years. He's no closer to his neighbors than he was before, but he has managed to accumulate this secret stockpile of gold coins, which he takes out every night. So is anybody feeling theatrical or dramatic and would like to read for us? Otherwise, I can do it. Gordon?
Sure, thanks. I'll read the whole paragraph. This is a history of Silas Marner until the 15th year after he came to Raveloe. The livelong day he sat in his loom, his ear filled with its monotony, his eyes bent close down on the slow growth of sameness in the brownish web. His muscles moving with such even repetition that their pause seemed almost as much a constraint as the holding of his breath. But at night came his revelry. At night he closed his shutters and made fast his doors and drew forth his gold. Long ago the heap of coins had become too large for the iron pot to hold them, and he had made for them 2 thick leather bags, which wasted no room in their resting place, but lent themselves flexibly to every corner. How the guineas shone as they came pouring out of the dark leather mouths. The silver bore no large proportion in amount to the gold, because the long pieces of linen which formed his chief work were always partly paid for in gold, and out of the silver he supplied his own bodily wants, choosing always the shillings and sixpences to spend in this way. He loved the guineas best, but he would not change the silver, the crowns and half-crowns that were his own earnings, begotten by his labor. He loved them all. He spread them out in heaps and bathed his hands in them. Then he counted them and set them up in regular piles, and felt their rounded outline between his thumb and fingers, and thought fondly of the guineas that were only half earned by the work in his loom, as if they had been unborn children, thought of the guineas that were coming slowly through the coming years, through all his life, which spread far away before him, the end quite hidden by countless days of weaving. No wonder his thoughts were still with his loom and his money when he made his journeys through the fields and the lanes to fetch and carry home his work, so that his steps never wandered to the hedge banks and the lane side in search of the once familiar herbs. These too belonged to the past, from which his life had shrunk away, like a rivulet that has sunk far down from the grassy fringe of its old breadth into a little shivering thread that cuts a groove for itself in the barren sand.
Okay, thank you so much for reading that. Well, I have a feeling people will have thoughts about this scene. You know, the literary miser is definitely a trope. Timothy Alborn has recently written a book on the history of the miser in reality and in literature. But this is certainly a memorable image of Silas, like, literally being in love with his money. What did this scene? I mean, I know many of you had read the novel before, but like, how did you react to this behavior?
Kathy. We have one hand, Kathy.
Well, 2 things. One is I was really appreciative of you putting that article in about money. I can honestly say I never really understood what the gold standard was, but this came at a time when the form of money was changing. And, you know, I guess it's just a historical piece, but that was interesting to me. And as far as him having it, like, what the hell else did he have? You know, his life was not filled with
Right. Exactly.
very much of anything. And so he, um, you know, he came and he played with the gold, but it was almost like it was his friend. He never spent it. And I think that's what you have to remember, that it wasn't for any other reason, just to be with him. It was a friend of his. And so, you know, that's my take on it.
But of course, you know, we're not supposed to love money for itself, right? We're
Yeah.
just supposed to spend it. I mean, the implicit moral critique is so obvious, it doesn't even need to be said. And yet, you know, where is this desire for love, and even for just like sensual contact and imagined companionship? Where are those impulses supposed to go when you are so alone, as he is?
Right.
Ginny,
Yes, I know this is going to sound really funny, but for those who've ever seen Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which I happen to love, but there's a song in it, Ringle, Ringle, coins when they jingle. And that's all I could think of when I read this, because that's exactly what he does. He piles the money up and he runs his finger through it and he pours it out. And the whole time he's singing and he puts the little coins in his eyes. And it really made me think of this, because Scrooge was in this particular thing, was just worshiping the money and stacking it up every night in this little song. And it really, I couldn't believe it was almost an exact description for Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol of what he was doing during this song. And so I think it's fascinating, because the whole idea of, I mean, when I was younger too, my grandfather would give me $100 bill if I could save $95. And I was always stacking up all my little monies, you know, thinking about when I could get that crisp $100 bill. And I know that obviously it's a moral thing not to want money, but I think it's interesting that a lot of people worship money, and also looking at some times of like cryptocurrency where people can't even touch their money anymore. What would poor Silas have done if he'd lost his crypto code? So that's sort of just a humorous take on this.
Wayne.
I had to put in a plug for the Ben Kingsley movie of Silas Marner, which I showed every year. I had to start out with the pirated version in 1985. Then I showed it every year, and it really helped. But in this particular scene, when he dumps out the coins, Ben Kingsley gasps. And I think the kids really understood that. And they also got to see just how beautiful these guineas would have been coming out from the bags that way. And one other thing about the movie, if we don't get to it, the movie adds a scene where Godfrey Cass goes to visit Molly Farron. It's not in the book, but it's a brilliant addition in the BBC movie. It was very, very helpful to see.
Sorry, what was the movie?
I'm sorry?
What
I'm
was
talking
the
about
name
the
of the
BBC
movie?
adaptation with Ben Kingsley.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
It is in one of the mails that we got. Together with the 3 documents, they also give a link to the movie.
Russell.
I was going to say that the for Silas, the gold has become his idol. You know, he started out in his early life where he was very religious, and that was the focal point of his life. Everything in his life revolved around it. But I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that Silas's loneliness has really come from a situation that started in the big city. So we're kind of harsh on this small town, but many times the people in the town reached out to Silas. And even, for example, when he did the herbs for the lady, well, then all the town started coming to him, and he could have simply said, "Oh, I don't know anything, or I can't." But he shut them down. He wanted to have nothing to do with them. So he had opportunities to get out of his loneliness, but he elected to stick with his gold.
Yeah, if I recall, in the Simple Twist of Fate film, Steve Martin character who plays the Silas figure is also an alcoholic. So I think that there is he kind of like closes his curtains at night, and, pours his drinks or whatever. And it's that there is I love your point about idols, and there's a passage in there where George Eliot talks about how in days of yore, different geographic locations had their individual idols, which they worshipped, and she likens Silas's love of gold to that. But there's also I think there's an addictive quality to his relationship with his gold and to this nightly routine, and we haven't quite gotten to it yet, but addiction, like drug addiction, is a theme in this novel. You've already seen where the Cass brothers are all like start drinking at breakfast, but I'm not really spoiling anything to say that Molly is an opium user, and that figures in the plot. For those of you who've read it, you know that. So I don't know if that's it's just two different ways to look at this kind of obsessive relationship to the coins. Is one is he's worshiping them, but he may also be addicted to
Sarah has had her hand up, and then Ben.
Another book.
Yeah, I just thought in the last paragraph that was read, the writer analyzes, gives us some psychology, and she said he even stopped collecting his herb, and she says his life shrunk. So it's not just that he got a new hobby, but like people said here, it was addictive, and he lost some good activities that he used to do, like go out to the green fields and collecting herbs. So it was a shrinking of his life. It wasn't another thing that he added to his life.
Ben.
Yeah, I'm almost reluctant to say it, but as I was reading through this passage, I kept thinking about money earned from long hours of working in isolation. And I couldn't help but think about if George Eliot might be playing, maybe kind of coyly with her own status as a writer, particularly as someone who at this point has become, a pretty established writer, has had several successful novels. I'm wondering if there's maybe kind of almost a tongue-in-cheek element. I don't know if I know enough about her own kind of relationship with money, or what she did with her money as she was earning it, but that was the thing that came to mind for me, and I'd love if anybody had any insight on that front.
I love that. I think that spinning or weaving is traditionally a kind of a figure for writing, right? You're weaving stories, weaving fictions. So in that way, like very fundamentally, I think that there can be an association between George Eliot, the author, and the character of Silas Marner. But the question that you raise about money is just so interesting. I have written quite a bit about George Eliot's money, and she suddenly had a lot of it, which she hadn't had before, and she was very conflicted about it. She often felt that she should do more good things with the money that she had, but yet it was also clear that she enjoyed accumulating it and spending it on herself, and she had guilt about that. But yeah, I like that. I think you're on to something, that it's not just necessarily somebody looking at a distance and judging the behavior of the character, but there might also be something very personal into it. And she did, at the end of every year, I think she kind of enjoyed like adding up all of the money that she had earned from her writing. It's there in her notebooks, and while that's not at all an uncommon thing to do, I always got the impression that there was a certain pleasure about just knowing that she had earned that money. And especially a woman, being able to earn that money for herself and to have that independence. Yeah, so good question. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about it.
Frisky.
I would just add one other dimension to this, is that it is very sensual. It's physical, it's erotic. It's the comic version of this, to back to the Scrooge Christmas Carol, is Scrooge McDuck, who bathes in his money. And it's the bodily sensation of caressing the money, not the value of it in terms of what he can spend it on. He spends his silver on his bodily needs, but he has bodily needs that are satisfied by the coin, by the gold. The gold is a bodily satisfaction. It's touch, it's caress, it's sensual, and it's unborn children. I mean, all of those things seem to me to take it in that other dimension of, a sexual dimension of addiction.
Yeah. No, thanks for bringing that up, John. The scene has been referred to as masturbatory, for sure. I mean, I think that's mostly due to the secret nature of it. Why should his sensual love for his money be so secret? Almost as if, obviously he doesn't want his money to be stolen, although it is eventually stolen, but I think he knows there would be social disapprobation if anyone were to come upon him bathing himself in his money, but also just to maybe go in the direction of sex and sexuality in the novel. Silas, obviously, he had a fiance, he was betrayed by his best friend. There's no thought subsequently of him having any interest in any kind of romantic or sexual relationship, and that remains true. And yet, on the other hand, you have this kind of other plot where Godfrey has gotten himself in trouble by marrying and impregnating a lower class woman, which also has to be kept as a secret. So, it's a funny thing about George Eliot. She's thought of as such a moralizing novelist, and as we know, Victorian novels couldn't actually represent sexual acts per se, but there's always so much sex in them. And I think in this case, it's important to think about that the secret wife is there, and that Silas perhaps does have a sexuality that's just been repressed, but maybe has to come out in some other way, as John was saying, about the sensuality of his relationship to the coin.
And I'll Patricia in just a minute, but I'll add one other thing, which is that I was struck by how male this book is, at least the first 10 chapters. There's only one woman, who is Mrs. Winthrop. There's the sweetheart at the beginning, but it's really thus far a book about men. There just aren't any women. So, Patricia.
Sure. I would like to speak in defense of Silas Marner. Not so much his reveling in the gold, but and I may excuse me, I'm not sure I made a mistake by watching the BBC movie before I finished the end of the book, but in the movie and probably in the book itself, it depicts how hard he worked for that money. And, having grown up in the same era, probably as the rest of you elders, and having probably read the book in the 60s, not remembering it, but I do remember the caution that my mom gave me to make sure that I saved money for my old age. So, you know what? I see what he was doing. He was working harder and harder and harder and putting away the guineas and the gold and the silver. The relishing in it is bizarre, but on the other hand, you know, he earned his money, and then some of it was taken away from him incorrectly. So I'd like to give a kudo to Silas Marner.
Fair
He
enough.
works, he
Yeah.
works for 14 hours a day.
Yeah, well, we haven't, so if we just move forward a little bit plot-wise, we do get to the theft of the gold, which of course, having seen how much he loves it in and of itself is, of course, devastating for him. And of course, it's not really a mystery novel for us because we know who's stolen it. Although we don't know where Dunsey has gone with it yet. I was hoping that we could spend a little bit of time on the rainbow chapter and maybe just start by thinking about how George Eliot handles time in the novel, and especially in this section where we have Silas's money has been stolen. He's bewildered, and this is chapter 6. And he can't think of anything to do except to rush into the town and try to find somebody who's in charge to help him. And so what George Eliot does is she has him running from his cottage down to the rainbow. He gets to the rainbow, and the first sentence of chapter 6 is the conversation, which was at a high pitch of animation when Silas approached the door of the rainbow, had, as usual, been slow and intermittent when the company first assembled. So Silas is at the threshold, waiting there to burst in and tell everyone about his stolen guineas. But then she just leaves him standing there, goes inside the rainbow, and indulges in this, very long and complicated and interesting bit of local color, right? Where you get these characters, most of whom are defined by their profession. And the reason I would love to talk about this chapter and to know what you thought about it is, and I think the first few times I read this novel, I just kind of ignored it. I thought, oh, well, this is just like people rambling on. Yeah, I get it. They're rustic. They believe in ghosts. They, this and that. But like now I'm kind of obsessed with it, because so many interesting themes come up in addition to giving you a more personalized sense of the village identity and character. The village is not speaking in one voice in this chapter. The village is people are arguing with each other. People have completely different worldviews and different opinions. They're teasing each other about their singing, things like that. So, but all the while, Silas is there, and we get this long kind of piece of men. As John pointed out, this is 100%. You're not going to find any women in the pub on a Saturday night or whatever it is. And then at the end of the chapter, the conversation is abruptly interrupted by Silas coming in the door. So I think that's an interesting kind of tension that she creates just artistically and structurally. But I also thought it would be fun to talk about some of the content of what, if you want to, if you have other things you want to talk about, that's fine. But did anybody have, and we could read a bit of it, but did anybody have any initial impressions about that particular chapter? I think Wayne mentioned it earlier, but did you just kind of not really care what was going on and while the locals were yammering on, or did you find it interesting?
Sarah. Can't hear you. Unmute.
Yeah, I like the chapter, and I thought there was a discussion between the people, and it was interesting to watch how people form their opinion and how like different opinions are formed. And then you have the host will always settle things. Like when they talk about the music, he thinks he shouldn't be in the choir because he doesn't sing well, and he said everybody interprets things differently. So I thought it was a very interesting discussion. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And Clark mentioned humor.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it here. I'm just going to read this one line. It's the next line in the at the beginning of chapter 6. The pipes began to be puffed in a silence which had an air of severity. The more important customers who drank spirits and sat nearest the fire, staring at each other as if a bet were depending on the first man who winked, while the beer drinkers, chiefly men in fustian jackets and smock frocks, kept their eyelids down and rubbed their hands across their mouths as if their draughts of beer were a funereal responsibility attended with embarrassing sadness. And I don't know, I can just picture that, like a bunch of guys sitting around drinking their beer, looking at the ground, not really wanting to start the conversation. I think George Eliot is poking a little bit of fun at this all-male society to begin with. But
And it ends with a ghost story that they cannot agree if there is a ghost, and how can you prove that there is a ghost? And then the next chapter, he shows up as looking like a ghost. So it's really funny. Yeah.
Clark.
I think the paragraph at the end of the preceding chapters also sets this up beautifully, because Eliot distinguishes between she talks about the structure of the rainbow and how a certain class congregates in one section and another congregates in another, and this evening is freed of the upper echelon because of the Osgood party. And so I feel like you've got these guys in the pub they're not being watched tonight. It's like the pub is theirs, and they can freely try to jostle for their own position, jockeying for power in that redefined social area. One of my students called this "hanging with the bros," so I thought that was
exactly, yeah. I love that. And there's so many. There's like the conversation really ranges widely, and there's so many themes. I have just one other slide that I wanted to show you guys that is related to this. One of the themes that comes up, and I'm a little obsessed with this because I've been writing about like veterinarians and farriers in literature. And here's the farrier, and he's been dosing the cow that was sold to the butcher, and that implies that the cow that the butcher slaughtered was sick in some ways, and that maybe the cow was like quickly slaughtered so that no one would know that it was sick. So there's kind of a serious implication there. But the reference to breeds, I thought, is very interesting. Oh, it's a red Durham cow. Well, if it's a red Durham cow, it must belong to the Lammeters, because the Lammeters are the only ones that have red Durham cows. And then we're told the story of how the Lammeters came from a different part of the country, and they came in and they had a particular kind of sheep and they had a particular kind of cow that no one had ever seen before. And this is all historically very accurate. Ava, could you pull up the very last slide? If you're still able to do that. So I just thought you might like to see, this is a red Durham bull. It was, of course, the novel refers to a cow, not a bull, but this is what I could find. And it was a very fancy breed that was being created in the late 18th and early 19th century. And just the very fact that the Lammeters were engaged in this fancy kind of breeding, and that they were themselves they became a first family. And then you get the whole story of who married who and who the children were. And now we have the story of Nancy Lammeter, who Godfrey wants to marry. And there's a question of like fertility and infertility and breeding and the perpetuation of the families, all within the context of the breeding of the animals. I'm just throwing that out there as one of the things that was introduced in this chapter. And Ava, you can go back now. But these breeds were so special that they had their portraits painted like that. And I thought you might just like to see that.
Wayne has his hand up.
Yes, I have to confess that I found a video of an actual cow drenching on YouTube, which I showed my 15-year-old boys, and it's hard to gross out 15-year-old boys, but the cow drenching really shocked them, I think.
Oh wow, I'm impressed. I haven't it was like a
They
drenching
really do it.
egg or yeah. Oh yeah, drenching is just like forcing some kind of medicine down the throat of the cow, right? And trying to purge
Yes.
it.
Yes, purging the cow, basically. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's also, it's interesting that, of course, there is no veterinarian to be called. It's got to be the farrier, and the farrier's like knowledge is called into question, and the farrier, you know, is challenging the butcher. And like all of these folks are identified by their profession, but they're also, yeah, it goes back to this sort of absence of more institutionalized authority. I mean, the farrier is treating the cow, but he doesn't really know what he's doing. I think is the implication.
What exactly is a farrier? What are the duties of a farrier?
Well, a farrier is mostly a shoer of horses and someone who is knowledgeable about hoof health. Today, that's all that farriers do. But at this time, in the absence of trained veterinarians, farriers would just step in and treat all aspects of animal illnesses and diseases, even though they were not educated or trained to do that. They would mostly be relying on folk wisdom. So there's also a parallel between that and Silas's folk wisdom, like the knowledge of treating people that he inherits, and how that's kind of contrasted to the doctor in the town. So yeah, farriers. But now, you know, you might want to ask John, like, what's the difference between a farrier and a blacksmith? And it gets complicated, you know, because, you know, Joe Gargery shoes horses, but he doesn't treat cattle, right? He's a blacksmith, but farriers are supposed to know about, and it's a very ancient profession. Every town would have one.
Ginny.
Quickly, just first about the farriers, of course, you know, the cows and horses have to have their hooves trimmed, and they're susceptible to things like thrush and diseases getting their feet, and their feet grow. And without a farrier to trim those feet and keep them from being lame, it can really affect things going on. And also, I'm pretty sure farriers were like used like as a dentist, like if they needed teeth pulled. A farrier, just because of their knowledge of how they work things, you know, and the tools they had, could be called on for a lot of things. But I was thinking in this particular scene where they came in, I thought it was a further emphasis of how Silas just had no connection really with the town, because it was a great show of how everybody knows everybody's business. Like they suddenly cut away and everybody's talking about, you know, how they know these people's cows and what's going on and all the different things. And then there's Silas at the door, and nobody's like, hey, Silas, you know, what are you doing? What's happening with you? He doesn't really know anything or anybody. And it really emphasized by cutting away to this scene and everybody knowing something about everybody else's business and what they all did, that Silas, as the weaver, was not a part of this town. And so they finally just turn around and be like, oh, you know, why are you here? You know, we don't see you. But I felt like she did a great job of putting that scene together to really emphasize how apart from the town he was.
Great points. Yeah. Did you notice or like, what kind of reaction did you have to this little story about the Lamaters possibly not being married because the parson was drunk and said the wrong words. I mean, it's hysterical, but it's also, as I said before, as part of George Eliot's interrogation of, well, what really is marriage? The letter of the law. He says, well, is it? He asks, isn't it the meaning of the words that makes folks wedded? So in other words, he's Mr. Macy's telling the story. He was present at the time, and he's the only one who realizes that the parson has said, where is it? Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded wife? Says he, and then he says, wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded husband? And then he panics because he thinks, it's a speech act, right? This is what marries them. And if he doesn't say it right, then they're not really married. And then they would be like living in sin. He panics about it. And eventually the parson's like, no, it's signing the registry. That's what makes them married. It has nothing to do with the vows or, what gets said. And for us literary critics, we go to town on this kind of thing, but, and George Eliot too, as a novelist, it's like what does the actual meaning of vows, what relationship does that have to the institution of legal marriage? The power of language, or the lack of the power of language. And she just throws that in, I love it.
Russell had his hand up before. Did you want to say something? You took it down. So
Yeah, I was just going to say that despite the fact that Silas was an outsider when he came into this pub, he was really treated respectfully by the people in when they took him seriously and they didn't sort of tell him to get lost or anything. So I thought that was a positive thing from the town perspective.
Okay. Barb.
Yeah, this switch up of the genders in the marriage vow thing and how they react to it, it goes back to our beginning, the tight-knit community, the superstitions, the things that the community valued. In addition to growing up in a small town, when I lived in England, I lived in a town that had 250 people in it. And you would go into the pub and you couldn't sit in certain chairs because even though Tim had died 50 years ago, it was still his chair. And you had only a certain array of mugs that you could choose because the others belonged to dead people who, and but that she keeps hammering on that theme right from that she starts out in the beginning, and I think it's it's very humorous, but it's also spot on.
Clark.
I think it's important that this is a ritual. They've heard this story many times and they delight in hearing the same story over and over again. Every one of Mr. Macy's audience had heard this story many times, so it was listened to as if it had been a favorite tune. So this is like, listening to pop music on the radio. It's a ritual. It's a static event in which they just want to play their familiar parts, and it's hysterical and horrifying at the same time.
Sarah.
I just want to add because we talked about memories before, like when you change to a country, Silas lost his old memories and didn't yet create new memories. So I think the story about the wedding, it's a memory, and from many years ago, and he remembers it because he was the only one who paid attention. So I think it's also like a story about memories because he stayed in the same place for a long time. He does have memories.
Yeah, Mr. Macy is the town memory.
Yeah.
He is deferred to as that. He's kind of an interesting character. You know, he's an old bachelor. He's a tailor who's proud to be a tailor, and his father was a tailor, and he just kind of sits back and recounts these stories. So, yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts about the ghosts and the argument about, you know, whether there really is a Cliff's Holiday, whether the ghosts come out at night or whether they don't, and how that functions? And then, of course, you know, someone's already mentioned that it like works so well because Silas appears as if he is a ghost. But it seems to me that you know, that there isn't just an explicit debate between empiricism and superstition, I guess. Wayne?
Wayne.
I probably undertaught Cliff's Holiday. It's a very emotional thing. I taught students who are very high risk for suicide. And Cliff's Holiday is about a man who was determined to make his son be a gentleman. And believe me, I had boys whose fathers were determined to make them athletes or whatever they aspired to be. Mm-hmm. And not all of them survived that through college, I'm sorry to say. But when we read Cliff's Holiday, every boy in that classroom, I think, understood. Writing the London tailor out of his son, and then his son dies. And so the father haunts the stables, at least for a time before the father himself died. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. There is a kind of like a tragic dimension to the story, because it's told that the boy was scared. The boy didn't want to ride. The father said, "You're going to ride." It isn't necessarily that isn't given as the cause for his death, but he becomes sickly and dies, and then the father kind of loses his mind. So yeah, it's sort of slipped into the realm of legend, but what we learn of it does seem very real and very powerful. And I think that social class mobility theme obviously is also important here in this novel and in Victorian literature generally. You know, I think the tailor who's trying to escape his background and become a gentleman is quite familiar. And of course, I like the fact that it's like the horses too, who are the ghosts. And
yeah,
that's who you'll hear if you go out to the stables in the middle of the night.
Frisky.
Oh God, Steve.
It's right on.
Nancy, when you talked about how long Silas waits at the door before he's allowed to come in this scene, you referred to that as a sort of structural device, and that I think that's a device that the novel uses elsewhere. I mean, the beginning of the novel is so tightly focused on Silas and his experience, and then there are long sections, at least in the first half, that are devoted to the Cass brothers and their family drama. And so Silas is kept waiting. I mean, there were chapters there where I said, when is Silas? When are we going to get back to Silas? I mean, you know, he's kept waiting at the door in a sense at other points in the book. And
yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And we're all, you know, as readers of Dickens, we're all familiar with the multi-plot novel. And I think, one of the nice things about Silas Marner, maybe for teaching, as well as just reading and analyzing, is that it's kind of a multi-plot novel, but it's only got, a couple of plots, so that you really, you can really see the mechanism and you can really start to think, well, where is Silas while we're having the Cass brothers story, and then you wonder, well, how are the plots going to converge? Because that they are, and that's another kind of thing that why Silas coming into the Rainbow is really a turning point, because even though the Cass family's not there, we know that this is sort of the beginning of his entry into society. And as you read forward, you'll also notice the tracking of time by the seasons and by the festivals. So you have Christmas, the Christmas party, and then you have the New Year's Eve party, and the New Year's Eve party is going to be another big scene with a lot of local people and dancing, partying, and stuff, and that's it's a device that she's going to use to bring the two plots together. But yeah, John, I often think about Helena's meanwhile analysis. She talks about what's going on meanwhile while Silas is standing at the door. This conversation is going on. So I'm sure those of you who've taught the novel have thought a lot about this. But I'm kind of talking myself into why it's such a great novel to teach, even if some of the high school kids might be too young for it. But obviously Wayne's done it and Clark's done it today. Are there like final things, anything anywhere that we haven't discussed that you've been wanting to talk about?
I have a comment. I came late and I apologize. My phone wasn't working and my computer's in Apple Hospital. So I found it very incongruous that Silas is so ignored. It's like he really doesn't exist, but whereas he's doing this incredibly important functional weaving fabric for the community, and he must have had interactions, and yet he's ignored. And I don't know how much fabric was actually produced at that time where they could have access to it. He's made a tablecloth. He's doing something for 15 years, and that, but yet he's ignored, and it sounds like he's the only weaver in town.
This is a quilter speaking.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt he's doing important work, and I think that's one reason why they kind of tolerate him. But you notice that at the beginning he is like the children taunt him. I kind of noticed on this reading that kind of forgotten that Dunsey and Godfrey remember being among those boys that are taunting him when they were small. But then he's been there for so long, and he's just, as you said, he's just, once they realized that he was neither going to cure them nor hex them, like a witch, that people just decided to ignore him and leave him alone and let him do his useful weaving, and he's useful to the housewives, but everybody else just kind of leaves him alone in his eccentricity. She's very careful about the lapse of time.
I'm sorry. David and Sarah and Kathy have hands up.
Okay. I would suspect that Silas sells his weaving outside the town. His market is not the community. Cottage weavers worked that way. Unrelated question, Nancy, do you know whether anyone made a silent movie of Silas Marner? It's interesting, something that old, to find out what the people then thought was the important part of the story.
Great question. And yes, there is. There's at least one, there may be more than one silent version, but there's one from, I think it's like 1916 or something like that, that you can actually, you know, you can stream, you can view, I think in full. And I was just looking around for it this morning, and one thing that I noticed is that like the whole first section of the film is sort of an elaboration of the, you know, the Lantern Yard. You know, the backstory is where it begins, and it kind of the romantic relationship that Silas has with Sarah and all that is the narrative is just kind of simplified in that way. But yeah, I think we should. I don't know if anyone else has
Let
seen
me
that.
just mention, there are at least 4, maybe 5 silent versions, but I don't know about access to them. But that listing is there, whether it's Wikipedia or whatever, that we have the years and we have the titles, and I think they were almost always just called Silas Marner.
Thanks, Carol. I've only seen the one, so maybe Jenny, were you?
There's 1911, 1912, 1913, 1916, and 1922. And the 1912 version is French, Le Noël de Silas Marner, Silas Marner's Christmas, a French production, but the rest are all titled Silas Marner. So there are 5 of them.
Interesting.
We have 3 hands up, Sarah, Kathy, and Linda. Sarah.
So, we have 2 stories of theft of money, and the evidence that they collect to find the person who stole the money is very similar. So, in the first case, with Silas, they find the knife, and they say, since we found a knife, the person who stole the money must be the owner of the knife, and they accuse Silas. And when Silas gets stolen, they find a tinderbox, and the same logic. They say the person that left the tinderbox there must be the one who stole, and it turns out to be the peddler, so it adds layers. But originally, they have the same logic for deciding who stole the money. And Silas himself suspects a person named Rodney, right? Because Rodney wasn't nice to him, and he asked him about his money a few times, and he suspects him. But when he comes to the Rainbow and talks to the people, and very quickly he is convinced that he accused him for nothing, and he remembers how he felt when he got accused unjustifiably, and he goes and apologizes to him, and it's a very beautiful section.
I mean, yeah, I'll just say quickly that I love that, because it's just hysterical the way the town like tries to find clues. And you know, if this were really the era of detective fiction, I would say that George Eliot is satirizing detective fiction, because you know, like what counts as a clue, the reader knows is not at all. So I agree with you that that's a very touching scene. But I also just kind of also love the like her laughing at people trying to be detectives in such an ineffectual way.
Yeah. Kathy.
No, I never know how to. Okay, this is just, it's not a minor thing, but we haven't really discussed this, that George Eliot is really a woman. So when you talk about, you know, in the plot, like only men appearing in the first half, except for the 2 women, it's interesting to me that, you know, she has experienced, I mean, obviously in her society, you know, women cannot be publishers, so, or writers. So therefore, she has to publish as a man. And I mean, who knows what's in the minds of writers? I mean, you just have to make it up. But, you know, she's obviously, you know, had to do that to earn her own money. And um, I don't, you know, I'm not, I can't even say that this affects the plot, but I think it's important.
Linda.
I had a question. In the last chapter for this discussion, various community members come and try and get Silas to join them at church. And the narrator makes the comments that Silas Marner knew not church, but chapel, and there were no bells in Lantern Yard, but we hear them all the time in Raveloe. And I just couldn't figure out why those observations were inserted.
Just real quickly, it's to make a distinction between the sort of evangelical sect that Silas belonged to, which would have been very bare bones, you know, no bells,
okay.
no
Okay.
rituals, just you know, these evangelical sects, which wouldn't even necessarily belong to any denomination, they would just kind of like spring up independently. Were, you know, they're not Church of England. They're technically dissenters. So Silas, he didn't grow up knowing anything about the Church of England, and Raveloe was a very like conventional Church of England town. So the distinction between church and chapel is that. I mean, obviously there's more to say, but it's part of his otherness. I think it's part of his, you know, not really being part of the English society of Raveloe.
Clark.
I just had a question, completely out of context here, but I'm curious about the occasional reminder that this is a first-person narrator, because it's not overt. It takes a few pages and before you realize that there's someone talking, and occasionally this first person will intrude and offer some commentary. And I was, has anyone thought about that? Any ideas about that choice?
Well, if other people do, I'm happy to hear them. But it's just, I mean, it is typical of George Eliot in the first two in Scenes of Clerical Life and Adam Bede. She did actually have a more or less embodied first person narrator. I mean, it wasn't exactly a character, but it was at that time she was kind of trying to disguise herself as a man, you know, because her identity wasn't known yet, and so the I was clearly a masculine I. So, you know, like Carol, I'm sure you remember where she, you know, she talks about like talking with Adam Bede in later years and things like that. But this by the time we get to Silas Marner, this narrator, although it is a first person narrator, is completely disembodied and is in no way a character. And yet, you know, I mean, people have argued, is this George Eliot as opposed to Marian Evans who's speaking? Who is this narrator? But I think it's just, you know, it's just the omniscient narrator.
Yeah. Yes.
Barb and then Carol.
I just want to go back to the church and chapel thing because I think it highlights the isolation theme. The Church of England is a liturgical church, and therefore, on any given Sunday, everybody in the country would be hearing the same lessons and the same gospel. And the dissenter church would be very pastor oriented, and what the people would be learning about would be whatever the pastor had on his mind. And so you know, that identity with an isolated and often criticized group. I mean, they were not highly respected, and just more isolation and although she does say that Silas Marner himself didn't know much about religion, period. But I see it as a part of his whole isolation theme.
Carol.
On the subject of Eliot as narrator, I think I always jump the first time I see an I. And they are very few and scattered in these first 10 chapters. But if I think back to just what we have on The Mill and the Floss, we have a narrator who seems to be watching what's happening. We seem to have a narrator who falls asleep in her chair and then turns it all over to the Tulliver family. But what I most frequently encounter for purposes of my own teaching is what I call the mini essay, the times when she holds forth on a subject, whether it's just a matter of a sentence or two or one of her extensive paragraphs. And in particular, in Mill and the Floss, when we have the story of Tom coming home for the Christmas holidays for the first time, we are in his mind in terms of speculating about what he's thinking. And then it turns over very much to what is an authorial reminiscence about, again, her, because we tend to ascribe a female narrator here because of knowing George Eliot, what her experience was that is then very generalizable. So I think we move in and out of a sense of a narrator, but much of the time, especially in Silas Marner, it does seem to be very much the omniscience.
I would add just one other comment about that there's a we narrator or a we narration, which I think is close to the omniscient, but it's interesting to ask which we is she referring to? Is she referring to that we as the community in general, or is she including herself or distancing herself from the we, the general we that she observes? So there are two first-person narrations in this novel: the I and the we. Martha.
I would like to go back to this religion thing. I think that might be a real reason why these people at the Rainbow are really ignoring him, is because this religion thing's a really big thing. And here's my example. I married a man named Bob Stead. The Stead family came from England. They were not of the English church. And they decided, and those that died, and they lived in Leeds in Yorkshire. And if you died, you could not be buried in a regular cemetery. You had to be buried in a cemetery for the Quakers. And the Stead family decided to move to United States and came in 1804. And then some more family came over a little bit later than that. But and then they happened to have, and I don't know if this has to do with religion or something else, but they became true lovers of American politics and freedom, and named a whole bunch of kids after a lot of the presidents. So that's the example, that things went on like that and you weren't treated real well.
I mean, George Eliot was very interested in the dissenting communities. In Adam Bede's Methodism, she treats Dinah Morris as a female Methodist preacher, but Methodists were certainly not not welcomed within the Church of England. So not unlike Trollope, she's very interested in sort of the politics and the complexities of the Christian religious landscape at that time.
We are almost at the end of our 2 hours for today. This has been a wonderful experience for me. I've learned things and learned not to hate Silas Marner. I too read it in high school and had a hard time with it. But I want to thank you, Nancy, for leading us through the discussion of the first half of this. It was a wonderful experience, and we're honored to have had you. Is there anything you want to leave us with as we think about the second half of Silas Marner?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I was going to ask Wayne, if he wanted
Yes.
us to say anything in particular. I mean, I know it's going to be great because things really start heating up in the second half.
Okay, Wayne wants to wait and have his opportunity next month. So I won't put you on.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
But anyway, thank you again, Nancy, and come back when we do George Eliot again.
I definitely will.
Okay.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.